Welcome, friends. In this episode, we'll hear the story of Lianna and Daniel. Close your eyes and get ready to dive into the depths of your imagination. Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. The moon of Draeven did not have sunsets exactly. What it had was something the colonists called the bleeding. A slow, hourly shift in the sky's pigment as the gas giant it orbited swallowed more and more of the star's light, turning the atmosphere from pale amber to deep violet to something that had no name in any human language, and approximately 11 names in Draeven, most of them poetic and at least 2 of them profane. Daniel had been on Draeven for 6 hours, and he had already decided that it was the most beautiful place he had ever been, and also that his dress shoes were completely wrong for the terrain, and that these 2 facts somehow summed up his entire life. He stood in the arrivals hall of the Draeven colonial port, a vast, cathedral-ceilinged space built from pale stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and tried very hard to look like a man who had been briefed thoroughly. He had been briefed thoroughly. He had read every document the Earth Diplomatic Corps had given him, attended every cultural sensitivity seminar, watched 6 hours of archival footage on Draeven customs, and still managed to knock over the ceremonial welcome urn within 4 minutes of clearing customs. It had not broken, a small mercy. The port official who had been standing next to it had given him a look that required no translation. The Draeven were tall. He had known this from the files. Knowing it and standing in a room full of them were, it turned out, entirely different experiences. They moved with a particular unhurried grace, their blue skin catching the ambient light in ways that made them look like they had been designed rather than born, which Daniel suspected was unfair to think and also completely accurate. Their ears, longer than a human's, curved to elegant points, seemed to orient toward sound with a subtle, unconscious precision, the way a satellite dish turns toward a signal. He caught himself staring and looked at his shoes instead, his very wrong shoes. His liaison, a young Draeven man named Orel, who had clearly drawn the short ceremonial straw, appeared at his elbow with the expression of someone committed to professionalism in the face of significant personal trial. "The family is assembled in the reception hall," Orel said, in careful, slightly formal English. "They are waiting to present the Lady Lianna." "Right," Daniel said. "Great, I'm ready." "Your collar," Orel said, "is uneven." Daniel fixed his collar. Orel watched him fix it, then reached over and fixed it again properly. Daniel decided he liked Orel. The reception hall was everything the arrivals port was not. Warm and deliberately intimate, lit by what appeared to be living light sources. Bioluminescent organisms housed in tall glass columns that lined the walls and pulsed with a slow blue-white rhythm that made the whole room feel like the inside of something breathing. The floor was polished to a mirror finish. The ceiling was domed and painted with what Daniel would later learn was the genealogical history of Lianna's bloodline, rendered in pigments that were technically classified as sacred. He knew none of this yet. He just thought the ceiling was extraordinary, and tried not to gape at it like a tourist, with limited success. Her family was arranged in a formal arc near the far end of the hall. There were 11 of them, and they all had the same quality of stillness, the particular cultivated stillness of people who have been important for a very long time, and have learned that movement is something you grant sparingly. They watched him cross the room with expressions that ranged from politely neutral to something that might charitably be called evaluative. And then Lianna stepped forward, and Daniel forgot about the ceiling entirely. She was tall, as all Draeven were, with the characteristic blue of her skin deepened almost to indigo at her cheekbones. A pigmentation detail the files had mentioned was associated with her specific bloodline. Her ears caught the bioluminescent light and held it. She wore something dark and structural that moved when she did with a precision that suggested it was more engineered than sewn. Her face was still in a way that was not quite human stillness, not the stillness of someone suppressing expression, but of someone who had decided, long ago, that expression was a resource to be conserved. She looked at him the way you look at a piece of documentation you have already read, and found unsurprising. Daniel, because he was constitutionally incapable of silence in moments of high anxiety, said, Lianna. Sorry, I've been practicing that." Something moved across her face very quickly, and then was gone. He couldn't tell if it was irritation or amusement. He would spend the next 3 years learning to tell the difference, and he would eventually realize, much later, that in that first moment it had been both. Her mother, standing just behind her, said something in Draeven that Orel did not translate. Whatever it was, it made 2 of the 11 family members look at the floor. Daniel smiled at Lianna with the genuine, slightly helpless goodwill of a man who has knocked over 1 urn already and is simply hoping not to knock over another. She did not smile back, but she did not look away either, and he would learn, eventually, that for Lianna, these 2 things were not the same. The quarters assigned to them were in the eastern spire of the family compound, which Orel explained was an honor, and which Daniel privately thought was also a very effective way of ensuring they were as far from the main family wing as architecturally possible. He did not say this out loud. He was learning. The rooms were beautiful in the particular Draeven way. Everything functional and everything also somehow ceremonial, the furniture low and precise, the walls embedded with those same bioluminescent filaments that ran through the public halls like slow rivers of cold light. There was a viewport that looked out over the colony's outer ridge, where the silver dust of the moon's surface stretched toward a horizon that curved just slightly too fast. A constant, subtle reminder that you were standing on something smaller than you were used to. Daniel found it quietly vertiginous and deeply compelling in equal measure, which he was beginning to understand was his general response to Draeven as a whole. Lianna showed him the rooms with the efficient thoroughness of someone giving a tour they had not chosen to give. She named each space in Draeven first, then in English, her pronunciation of his language careful and exact in a way that made his 3 attempts at her name feel freshly embarrassing. The sleeping quarters, the washing room, the shared space, which was what it was called and apparently what it was expected to be. She showed him the environmental controls, a panel of luminous glyphs that managed temperature, air composition, and light levels, and explained once how they worked. The blue glyph reduces oxygen saturation for Draeven sleep cycles, she said. It will make you dizzy. Good to know, Daniel said. I'll avoid the blue glyph. The green glyph increases it for human comfort levels. I love the green glyph already. She looked at him for a moment with that expression he hadn't yet learned to read. Then she moved on to the washing room. He managed in the first week to activate the blue glyph twice by accident, mistake the Draeven food synthesizer for a storage unit, and spend 45 minutes locked out of the Eastern Spire because he'd used his access credentials in the wrong sequence. Oral rescued him on all 3 occasions with the patient, slightly mournful air of a man watching an inevitability unfold. Daniel began to suspect that Aurel had been specifically selected for this assignment because he was the person least likely to laugh. Lianna said nothing about any of it. This was not, Daniel was slowly learning, the same as not noticing. What she did instead was leave the correct glyph sequence written on a small card next to the environmental panel. The next morning, a second card appeared by the food synthesizer, with diagrams. They were good diagrams, detailed, precise, with small notations in both Draeven script and English. He stood and looked at them for a long moment, and something in his chest did a thing he didn't entirely know what to do with. He left a thank you note next to the card. In the morning, it was gone, and he couldn't tell whether she'd kept it or discarded it, and he found he minded very much not knowing. The family dinners were the most concentrated test of his constitution. They happened every 4th evening by the Draeven calendar, which did not divide into 7-day weeks and had a month structure that Daniel's brain simply declined to retain. In the lower hall, with the full family arranged around a table that seemed specifically engineered to seat exactly enough people to make everyone's social obligations maximally uncomfortable. Lianna's mother sat at the head. Her name was Sci-Fi, and she had the quality of a planet with significant gravitational pull. Everything in the room oriented toward her without appearing to, including, Daniel noticed, Lianna herself in the particular way of someone trying very hard to orbit at a safe distance. The food was served in courses, each one announced in Draeven by a household attendant with the solemn gravity of a religious rite. Daniel ate everything he was given, because he had been briefed that refusal was an insult, and because, genuinely, most of it was interesting. The third course of the second dinner was something that moved slightly on the plate, and he ate that too, with what he felt was admirable composure, while the cousin sitting across from him watched with undisguised scientific curiosity. You ate the Ficition, Lianna said quietly, from beside him. Was I not supposed to? No, you were supposed to. I'm just noting that most humans don't manage it without a visible reaction. I made a reaction. It was internal. She looked at her plate. I know, she said. I saw your hand. He looked at his hand. He had been gripping the edge of the table with exactly 2 fingers, in a way he had not been conscious of at all. He released it. The Ficition, she said, still looking at her plate, is considered a delicacy. Serving it to a guest is a form of respect. Then I'm glad I ate it. You could have told me it moved. Would you have eaten it? He thought about it honestly. Probably, but I would have liked the warning. The corner of her mouth shifted, not a smile. Something smaller, and he thought more real. He stored it away carefully, the way you store something whose value you don't yet fully understand but are almost certain is significant. Outside the viewport, the gas giant had begun its slow rotation into eclipse, and the sky above Draeven was deepening toward that nameless color again, pressing against the dome of the compound like something patient and enormous, waiting. 3 months in, Daniel discovered that Lianna read at night. He found this out accidentally, the way he found out most things about her, not through conversation, which she rationed with the careful precision of someone managing a finite resource, but through the small material evidence she left behind without meaning to. a half-finished glass of something dark and herbal on the table by the viewport. A thin, flexible data sheet folded open to a page dense with Draeven text. The faint glow of the reading filaments she activated at their lowest setting, a light so dim it was almost nothing, as if she were trying to read without technically admitting she was awake. He started staying up later. Not intrusively, he had learned very quickly that Lianna's personal space was a thing with real borders, invisible but absolute, and that the fastest way to make her close entirely was to push against them without permission. He just existed in the shared space at the same hours she did, at a comfortable distance, doing his own things. He had a backlog of Earth sector reports to read. He had been learning Draeven from a language program that Oral had installed on his tablet, with the encouraging words, "It is a difficult language. Most humans plateau at a functional level." Daniel had chosen to interpret this as a challenge. The language program was humbling in ways he hadn't anticipated. Draeven was tonal in 3 registers simultaneously, and the difference between saying "I find this interesting" and "I find this personally offensive" was a single half-step in the upper register that Daniel's ear consistently failed to distinguish. He spent an entire evening convinced he was practicing the phrase "for the stars are beautiful tonight" and discovered only when Lianna glanced up from her reading and raised one elegant eyebrow that he had in fact been repeating "the administrative fees are unreasonable" with great feeling for 45 minutes. "That is," she said, "actually also a useful phrase on Draeven. I feel like you could have told me sooner. You seemed committed." He pointed at her. "That was a joke. You made a joke." She returned to her data sheet. "I don't know what you mean." But the reading light stayed on a little longer that night, and he counted it. The nightmares started in the 4th month. He didn't know at first that they were nightmares, only that he woke sometimes in the deep part of the Draeven night cycle to a silence that felt different from regular silence, a taut and pressurized quiet that seemed to come from the other side of the room. He lay still the first time, uncertain and not wanting to intrude. The second time, he got up and got a glass of water and left a second glass on the table near the viewport without saying anything, and went back to bed. In the morning it was empty. The third time, he sat up and said, quietly, into the dark, "I'm awake if you need anything." A long pause. "I don't need anything," Lianna said. Her voice was level, but there was something behind the levelness, something pressed flat that hadn't quite finished pressing. "Okay," he said, "I'll just be awake over here for a while then. For my own reasons." Another pause. "You don't have reasons. You woke up because of me. My reasons are private and not subject to verification." Silence. Then very quietly, something that might have been the ghost of a sound. Not quite a breath, not quite anything. He lay back down and looked at the bioluminescent ceiling and didn't say anything else. And after a while, the quality of the silence changed back into something that could sleep in. He never asked her what the nightmares were about. She never told him. This was its own kind of conversation, and they were both, it turned out, fluent in it. Oral found him in the colony's lower market 2 weeks later, attempting to negotiate the purchase of a specific Earth import coffee blend with a vendor who was technically bilingual but had clearly decided today was not the day for it. "You are using the commercial tonal register incorrectly," Oral said, appearing at his shoulder with the resigned punctuality of a man who had accepted his fate. "You're implying the coffee is spiritually significant." "At this point in my life," Daniel said, "it is." Oral completed the transaction with 3 words and an expression. Daniel paid and considered asking what the 3 words meant, then decided some things were better left as mystery. Walking back through the market, a long vaulted space where Draeven vendors sold everything from bioluminescent flora to what appeared to be bottled atmospheric samples from other moons, Oral said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they've been weighing for some time, "The Lady Lianna used to come here. Before." Daniel looked at a jar of something that was either a preserved organism or an art piece, and said, "She doesn't anymore." "Less so. After the assessments." Oral paused. "When the healers made their determinations, she stopped coming to many places." Daniel didn't ask Oral to say the word Violeth. He'd heard it once at the 3rd family dinner, from a direction he'd memorized and a voice he hadn't forgotten. He'd looked it up that night because he hadn't needed the translation to hear what it was. He'd needed it to know exactly what it was, precisely, with no room for softening. He bought 2 jars of the bioluminescent flora on the way out. He put one on the table by the viewport when he got home, next to where the reading light usually was. He didn't mention it. Lianna didn't mention it either. But that night the reading light came on earlier than usual, and in the morning he noticed that the jar had been moved approximately 6 inches to a position where its glow would catch the viewport glass and spread a little further across the room. He left it exactly where she put it. The warmth arrived without announcement, the way the most significant things tend to. Lianna noticed it first as an anomaly. A Draeven body ran cooler than a human one, a fact that had practical implications for room temperature negotiations that they had resolved early on through a compromise involving the green glyph and 2 additional blankets that Daniel had requested from supply with the cheerful pragmatism of a man unbothered by logistics. Her internal temperature was something she had always been precisely aware of, the way you are aware of any system that runs correctly and quietly and asks nothing of you. So when it changed, she noticed a warmth that had no external source. A warmth that sat just below her sternum like something that had always been there and had simply, after a very long time, decided to turn on. She did not tell Daniel. She went instead to the colony's medical wing on a Tuesday. The Draeven calendar didn't have Tuesdays, but she had started marking time in Daniel's units almost without realizing it. The way you start using someone else's vocabulary when you spend enough time in their company. And she requested an appointment with the human physician. Her name was Dr. Voss, a compact, precise woman from the Earth Sector outpost who had a gift for clinical understatement and a wall full of xenobiology certifications that she never mentioned, and that Daniel had once spent 10 minutes reading aloud in genuine admiration while waiting for a routine clearance scan. Lianna asked for a full biological assessment. She did not say why. Dr. Voss, who had the particular professional tact of someone who had learned long ago that the most useful thing a physician can do in a delicate situation is simply proceed, did not ask. The scanning suite was a long, cool room lined with equipment that existed somewhere between Draeven biometric technology and Earth medical hardware, a collaboration of instruments that had taken the colony's Joint Technical Committee 3 years to calibrate, and that still, according to Dr. Voss, occasionally argued with each other about methodology. The primary scanner was a full-spectrum resonance unit, circular and humming, that read biological data at the cellular level and sent it in real time to a display that only the physician could see. Lianna lay still inside it with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent years being assessed by Draeven healers, which was its own kind of quiet endurance. Dr. Voss ran the scan. Then she ran it again. Then she looked at the display for a long time without saying anything, which was not, Lianna noted, her usual clinical rhythm. "I'm going to run a third pass," Dr. Voss said with the secondary array. "Is that standard? It is when the first 2 passes produce results I want to verify." The secondary array took longer. It was quieter. The hum of the machine dropped to something almost below hearing, and Lianna stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing with great concentration, which was something she had become very good at over the years and which was not. She had recently begun to suspect quite as useful a skill as she'd always believed. When Dr. Voss spoke again, her voice had the careful, deliberate quality of someone choosing every word with both hands. "Lady Lianna," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I am asking as a physician and not as someone who is confused, because I am also confused, but the 2 things are separate." Lianna sat up. "Ask. The warmth you've been experiencing. How long?" A pause. "I didn't tell you about the warmth." "No," Dr. Voss said. "You didn't have to." Lianna looked at the display, which Dr. Voss had angled slightly toward her, a small deliberate gesture, the kind that costs a physician nothing and gives a patient everything. She looked at it for a long time. The data was in a format she could read, because she had made it her business over the years to learn how to read the instruments that were used to measure what she lacked. She was fluent in the language of absence. This was not absence. She sat with this for a moment, that was longer than it appeared from the outside. "The xenobiological literature," she said finally, carefully, "is consistent on the subject of Draeven human biological compatibility." "It is," Dr. Voss agreed. "It's also apparently wrong." She pulled a second stool over and sat down with the air of someone who has decided that this conversation requires equal footing. "What I can tell you with certainty is what the scans show. What I cannot tell you is the mechanism, because the mechanism should not exist. And I have already spent 40 minutes this morning arguing with the scanner about it, and the scanner continues to be unrepentant." Something moved in Lianna's chest that was not the warmth, or was something she didn't have a category for yet. "There are 2 Draeven healers on the colony," she said. "Yes," Dr. Voss said. "You don't have to see them if you don't want to." "I don't want to." "Then we do this through my department, and we do it carefully, and we do it on your schedule." Dr. Voss said this with a simplicity that made it sound like an obvious thing, which it was not, and Lianna noted the gift of it without quite knowing what to do with gratitude of this specific size. She went home through the long corridor that ran along the colony's outer shell, where the viewport panels showed the full breadth of the moon's surface, silver and still and endless under the violet sky. She walked slowly. She had 3 days, she decided, to understand what she was carrying before she put it into words. 3 days to hold it in the space below her sternum where it had quietly taken up residence. To turn it over in the dark, the way you turn over something precious that you are not yet sure you are allowed to keep. On the 3rd day, she sat down across from Daniel at breakfast. He was attempting something with Earth import eggs that smelled aggressively optimistic, and she waited until he looked up. "I need to tell you something," she said. He put down the spatula. He did not ask what. He just turned toward her with his whole attention, the way he always did, as if whatever she was about to say was already the most important thing in the room. She told him. He cried before she finished the sentence, and she had prepared herself for many possible responses, but had somehow not prepared for that one. And something about the specific unprepared quality of the moment made it the most real thing that had happened to her in a very long time. The colony's scientific community did not take long to find out. This was in retrospect inevitable. Draeven was not a large settlement, perhaps 4,000 people between the Draeven population and the Earth sector contingent. And 4,000 people is exactly the size of community where significant information travels at the speed of personal investment, which is considerably faster than light. Within a week of Lianna's first confirmed appointment in Dr. Voss's department, there were 3 separate research inquiries submitted to the Colonial Medical Board requesting access to the case. Within 2 weeks there were 7. One of them came from a xenobiologist based on a station orbiting Jupiter, who had apparently heard through channels that defied rational explanation and had sent a 12-page preliminary paper along with his request, as if submitting his credentials to a conference he had not been invited to attend. Daniel read the paper over breakfast on a Thursday morning. "He's misspelled your name 4 times, he said. "He spelled it incorrectly in 4 different ways," Lianna said, which was a distinction she delivered without inflection, but which Daniel had learned to receive as its own category of dry commentary. "That's actually more impressive. Consistent misspelling suggests ignorance. Varied misspelling suggests creativity." She looked at him. "I'm not going to respond to the request." "I know. I'm not going to respond to any of them." "Also no," he set the paper down. "Dr. Voss is very good at making inquiries disappear into administrative procedure. I've watched her do it with my own clearance forms and I was honestly a little frightened." Dr. Voss was in fact proving to be a person of formidable organizational capability in addition to her clinical gifts. She had constructed around Lianna's care a bureaucratic perimeter that was technically compliant with every colonial medical protocol, and that also rendered outside access approximately as achievable as a walking tour of the gas giant. She had done this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who considers patient privacy a personal cause and institutional interference a puzzle to be solved before lunch. The Draeven healers came anyway, not through the medical board, through the family. Saeva sent word in the 5th month, phrased in the formal register that Lianna's family used for communications that were obligations dressed as invitations. 2 healers from the old practice, experienced, trustworthy. It would be appropriate, the message said, for the child of this bloodline to be attended by those who understood the bloodline. The language was careful, and the implication was total, and Lianna read it twice at the viewport and then set it down with a precision that Daniel recognized as the physical equivalent of a very controlled exhale. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. "Not yet." "Okay." He picked up his coffee. "Put it down." "For what it's worth." "I know what it's worth," she said, and she said it without sharpness, which meant she meant it, which was the thing about Lianna's economy of expression that he had come to trust completely. When she chose to say a thing directly, she meant all of it. She allowed 1 healer, not 2. The one she selected was an older woman named Val, who had the particular stillness of Draeven age, and who arrived without ceremony and examined Lianna with a thoroughness that was professional, and a silence that was respectful, and who at no point used the word Valeth or any of its cognates, a restraint that Lianna noted and filed carefully. Val confirmed what Dr. Voss's instruments had already established. She added in the tonal register reserved for clinical findings 3 observations about the child's developing biology that Dr. Voss found fascinating and immediately wanted to publish, and that Lianna said she could document but not distribute yet, and Dr. Voss agreed with the decisive nod of someone updating the schedule. The pregnancy itself had its own logic, which did not always consult either medicine or expectation before proceeding. There were weeks of profound exhaustion that were entirely Draeven in character, and weeks where Lianna's system ran at a temperature closer to Daniel's than her own, and one memorable Thursday where the bioluminescent filaments in the walls of their quarters began to pulse in an irregular rhythm that the building's environmental system had no record of initiating, and that Dr. Voss wrote 2 pages about before concluding, with admirable scientific honesty, that she had no explanation and was leaving it as an observation. "The walls are doing something," Daniel told Orel. "Yes," Orel said. "Do you know why?" Orel considered this with the expression of a man choosing between 2 kinds of honesty. "There are old accounts," he said carefully, "of the living architecture of Draeven compounds responding to significant events within them. It is not something the current scientific framework addresses. So the building is excited. I would not phrase it that way, but you wouldn't say I'm wrong. Oral looked at the wall for a moment. I would not say you're wrong, he confirmed, with the gravity of a man making a significant concession. The family visited with the stiffness that had become their particular register for this entire situation. They came individually more than collectively, which Daniel suspected was deliberate. There was less accountability in a series of private visits than in a collective acknowledgement that required everyone to be in the same room with what they had believed and said and permitted to be said. Lianna's aunt came and sat and talked about the colony's upcoming seasonal observance for 40 minutes without once referencing anything of substance, which was a performance of avoidance so technically accomplished that Daniel almost admired it. A younger cousin came and was simply quietly kind, which Lianna received with a stillness that had a different quality than her usual stillness. More careful, less defended. The stillness of someone not quite sure how to hold an unexpected thing without dropping it. So Ava came alone on a still evening when the gas giant was at its fullest in the sky, pressing its vast amber presence against the dome. She sat across from Lianna at the low table and said nothing for a long time, which in Draeven custom was not rudeness but weight, the weight of what hadn't been said accumulating until it was present in the room as a physical thing. Lianna let the silence run. She had always been better at silence than her mother, which had never before been an advantage. Finally, so Ava said in Draeven, something that Daniel didn't catch entirely. His register was still unreliable in moments of emotional density, but that Orel, later. When Daniel asked with the careful phrasing he had learned for questions that mattered, translated as something close to, I did not know what I was giving away. It was not an apology. It was something more complicated than an apology, and probably more true. Lianna, sitting across from her mother in the amber light with her hands folded in her lap over the warmth that had changed everything, said nothing. But she did not leave the room, which was its own kind of answer, and which Daniel, sitting quietly in the far corner with a cup of something Orel had told him was tea, and that tasted mostly like a well-intentioned hypothesis, recognized as the most significant thing he had witnessed in 8 months of witnessing significant things. He drank his hypothesis tea and did not say a word, because some rooms need to be left to the people who have earned them, and because he was by now genuinely fluent in the particular language of when to stay and when to simply be still. The child arrived on a night when Draeven forgot to be still. It began with the walls. The bioluminescent filaments that ran through every surface of the eastern spire had been pulsing irregularly for 3 days. Not the slow respiratory rhythm of normal function, but something quicker and more insistent, as if the building had been keeping its own kind of vigil. The environmental system had logged 17 anomalies and resolved none of them. The colony's chief engineer had come twice to investigate, found nothing mechanically explicable, and left both times with the expression of a man updating his assumptions about what buildings were capable of. On the third night, the light in their quarters shifted to a color that had no name, in the environmental system's chromatic index, something between the deep blue of Lianna's skin and the warm amber of the gas giant at full phase, and simply stayed there, as if it had decided this was what the occasion required. Dr. Voss was present. Vale was present. Orel had stationed himself in the corridor outside, with the loyal, slightly helpless dedication of someone who could not assist and could not leave, which Daniel had told him was both unnecessary and deeply appreciated, and Orel had said nothing and stayed anyway. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when everyone in them is concentrating very hard on something that matters. Daniel held Lianna's hand and did not make a single joke, which was, she would tell him later, the most frightening indicator of how serious the situation was. He had been so quiet for so many hours that at one point she had looked at him directly and said, with the dry precision that had become the private language of their life together, "You can say something, I won't tell anyone." And he had laughed, one short, slightly undone sound, and squeezed her hand and stayed quiet. She arrived just as the gas giant reached its apex in the sky, flooding the viewport with amber light that mixed with the wall's unnamed color into something warm and entirely new. She was small. This was the first thing, the simple animal fact of her, smaller than either parent had intellectually prepared for, despite all of Dr. Voss's careful measurements and Vale's experienced assessments. Small and extraordinarily present, the way that new things are present when they have not yet learned to take up less space than they occupy. Her skin was pale blue, not the deep indigo of Lianna's bloodline but something lighter, the blue of the sky at Draven's earliest dawn, before the gas giant's light had fully claimed it. Her ears curved to the faint beginning of a point, not fully Draven, not absent either, something negotiated and singular. And her eyes, when she opened them in the amber blue light of that unprecedented room, were dark and warm and entirely recognizably human in their depth. Vale made a sound that was not part of any clinical protocol. Dr. Voss wrote something on her data sheet, and then stopped writing and just looked. Orel in the corridor seemed to receive some atmospheric change in the quality of the silence, and pressed his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone deeply grateful to be exactly where they are. Daniel looked at his daughter and experienced a structural failure of some interior load-bearing wall he hadn't known was there. He did not try to recover from this. He had learned in the past 9 months that some things are not meant to be recovered from. Lianna held her. This was the thing that nobody in that room would entirely be able to describe afterward, when they tried, separately and together, to account for what they had witnessed. Not the biology, which was already extraordinary, not the walls which had shifted at the moment of arrival into a steady warm pulse that Dr. Voss would document and never fully explain. But this, Lianna, who had spent years perfecting the art of occupying space without requiring anything from it, who had built her stillness into something so complete that most people had stopped looking for what was underneath. Lianna held her daughter and her face opened, not dramatically, not in the way of theatrical revelation, simply and completely the way a room opens when someone finally raises the blinds. Not a new room, the same room, but suddenly full of a light that showed you everything that had always been there. She smiled. The great hall had been prepared by the family with the thoroughness of people who were managing collectively and imperfectly a significant revision to their understanding of the world. They had come, all of them, the full arc of the family that had stood in that same hall nearly 2 years ago, with their careful expressions and their quiet certainties, and the hall was lit and formal and arranged, and Sava stood at its center with the bearing of someone who has decided that the only direction available is forward. Lianna walked in carrying her daughter and Daniel walked beside her, and the family was very still. Not the stillness of judgment, not the performed stillness of Draeven formality, the stillness of people who have been stopped by something they were not equipped to anticipate, which was Lianna's face, which was that smile, which was, it turned out, almost impossible to look at directly. The way certain light sources are not painful but are simply more than the eye expects and requires a moment of adjustment that the eye does not always complete. Her aunt looked at the middle distance. 2 cousins found reasons to examine the floor. The younger cousin, who had come alone and been quietly kind, stood very straight and had the bright, slightly overfull expression of someone determined not to cry at a formal occasion and losing the negotiation. Saiva looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she looked at the child. Then she looked at Daniel with an expression that he had never received from her before and that he would spend some time afterward trying to classify and would eventually settle on as something in the neighborhood of acknowledgement. Not gratitude, not apology, not the concession of someone who has lost an argument, but the specific look of a person recognizing that they were wrong in a way that turned out to matter, and that someone else absorbed the cost of that without complaint, and that this is a debt that cannot be paid but can be named. He gave her a small nod. She returned it. It was, he thought, the most complete conversation they had ever had. Orel, standing near the entrance in his reliable position of loyal adjacency, caught Daniel's eye across the hall and performed the extremely subtle facial expression of a man who had known, from approximately the 4th minute of a particular diplomat's arrival on this moon, that it was going to be something, and who was privately satisfied to have been correct, and who would never say so out loud because he was deeply professional, but who wanted it noted. Daniel noted it. Lianna stood at the center of the great hall with the bioluminescent light moving across the pale blue of her daughter's face, and the child was awake and unhurried and looking at the world with the calm, comprehensive attention of someone who has arrived somewhere interesting and intends to stay. The walls of the hall, those ancient Draeven walls with their embedded filaments and their long memory, were doing the thing again, that steady, warm pulse that had no entry in any system log and no explanation in any framework, and the light it made was the same unnamed color that had filled the eastern spire on the night of arrival. And it was, Daniel thought, the exact color that you would get if you mixed the blue of Lianna's skin with the amber of the sky above their viewport on a quiet Draeven evening, which was to say it was the color of their specific life, rendered visible. He stood beside his wife in the light of a room that was learning to see her, and he watched his daughter watch the world, and he thought about a man who had arrived on this moon with 2 bags and the wrong shoes, and a name he couldn't pronounce, and who had understood nothing and stayed anyway, and who had been, it turned out, exactly right too. Lianna turned to look at him, and the smile was still there. Smaller now, quieter, the version of it that was just for him and had been for some time. The one she had never performed for anyone, and that he had watched arrive slowly over 2 years of reading lights and diagram cards and glasses of water left in the dark. And he looked back at her the way he always had, which was simply without strategy or management, like she was a person, which she was, which she always had been, which it had taken a room full of people who loved her too long and at too much cost to her to finally irrevocably see. Outside the dome, Draeven's sky was doing the bleeding again, that slow hourly shift through colors that had too many names and not enough, and the gas giant held its ancient position above them all, enormous and patient and utterly indifferent to the small extraordinary things happening beneath it, as the universe generally is, which has never once stopped those things from mattering completely. Well, friends, we've come to the end of another sci-fi traveler story. If you enjoyed Lianna and Daniel's story, please don't forget to hit the like button. Leave your thoughts on the story in the comments below and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next sci-fi traveler story. Goodbye.